There are, generally speaking, two types of Elder Dragon variants in Monster Hunter. The first is what I'm going to call a Lifecycle variant. This is an Elder Dragon which is either undergoing or has undergone some form of life cycle transformation. The first of this kind, and the first Elder Dragon variant in the franchise, is Rusted Kushala Daora. A Kushala Daora whose skin has rusted and which will soon molt, grown aggressive due to the growing discomfort of its oxidizing skin, like wearing ill-fitting clothes. This is a natural process, and so Rusted Kushala is a naturally emerging variant, although it can have aberrant forms. I have read, for example, that the Rusted Kushala in Monster Hunter 4U is unable to properly molt due to the scars inflicted upon it by the Master of Defense, rendering it trapped in a cycle of rusting without relief. I have been unable to verify this exactly outside of a note on the wiki, but I did want to include it, and if anyone out there has Monster Hunter 4U and can confirm, I would love to hear. Other than this one particular case, however, Rusted Kushala Daora are a naturally occurring part of the Elder Dragon's life cycle. The same holds for some other variants. Ruiner Nergigante is an older, more tempered Nergigante. Its spikes hardened over time and repeated regeneration. Nawa the All-Mother is a gravid Nawa, albeit also one that has eaten her mate in an act of sexual cannibalism. These two are arguably Elder Dragons at specific life stages, although both have some caveats that I'm going to discuss later. The concept of the life cycle variation Elder is even more apparent when one steps outside of designated variants and starts looking at misclassified subspecies, a common phenomenon in Monster Hunter games given the way that subspecies has historically worked in the franchise. Arguably, the only definite Elder Dragon subspecies are Orochi Kirin and possibly Hallowed Genmaran. Shah Dalamadur is merely a normal Dalamadur who has recently shed its skin, aggressive and unstable in its newfound vulnerability, the thematic inverse of Rusted Kushala. Goldbeard Ceadeus might just be an old Ceadeus, its horns evened out and its algae colonies reaching full symbiosis and brighter bioluminescence. Ashen Lao-Shan Lung has likely just acquired its muted carapace from living in volcanic environments more than any distinct process of speciation. These are, in short, elders with life cycles, and their variants, properly classified or not, capture part of that cycle as a means of presenting a new challenge to hunters. Indeed, while they are classed as different monsters for the purpose of guild threat assessment, Xenojiva and Safijiva and Gore and Shigara Magala are also emblematic of this model, a more mature Elder Dragon emerging from the shed carapace of the old, presenting a greater threat in a more mature stage of its life cycle. The Magala line is also emblematic of another type of Elder variant, the one I kind of want to discuss today. Not the variant as extension of intended life trajectory, but rather the variant as aberration, as deviant. Not here in the G and GU category sense of deviant, but rather just in the more general sense of having deviated in a crucial way from what the monster was meant to do or meant to be. The originator and poster child of this variant trajectory is Chaotic Gore Magala, the Magala who didn't make the cut, who remains trapped in a waking nightmare between two conflicted states of being, the one that went wrong, and which needs to be put down for the sake of itself and for everyone else. Good day everyone, this is Laraika Laray, your local gaming academic, and today I'm going to talk about Elder Dragon variants, what they are, and how their inclusion functions from both a narrative and a lore perspective, and in terms of franchise sustainability. So please like, subscribe, sit back, and relax. So let's begin with our favourite resident number 1 girl failure, Chaotic Gore Magala. A chaotic Gore is one who has failed to complete its metamorphosis, due to having this capacity suppressed by being beaten to the punch by another member of its species. When matured, the Shigara Magala's advanced strain of frenzy acts as a suppressant on competition, preventing other Gore from fully molting. Any who attempt or are already partly molted are stuck in a twilight state, becoming a wandering malformation. It lives in constant pain, attacks all it sees, and should probably be put out of its misery. Unlike designated subspecies, which in Japanese are merely marked by the suffix ashe, variants are given unique names, much as they are in English. The Japanese name for chaotic Gore Magala is Konton Niumeki Gore Magala, and while chaotic is an accurate translation, it loses something simply due to how chaos as a word is understood in English. Umeki is a verb meaning to groan or to moan, as one might in pain, and the word konton in Japanese means chaotic, confusion, and disorder, written with the kanji for mix, blend, or confuse, and the one for primeval or primordial chaos. Astute viewers may note that this is not the spelling that Gore Magala's variant uses. It uses an alternative spelling of konton, swapping out the initial kanji for another, which means all or turbidity, the cloudiness in liquids. Konton, in this context, refers not simply to a state of confusion, but rather to the kind of primeval watery chaos from creation myths, out of which all life emerges in religious cosmologies from Greece to China. Chaotic Gore is thus not only confused and lashing out in pain, but rather groaning with agony in the clouded quagmire of its own failed becoming. Variants like Chaotic Gore are one of the reasons I find the Magala line especially interesting in the world building and overall trajectory of the franchise. It sheds light on the species' ecology, expands possible combat encounters, and is visually arresting with its blend of gold and black scales, single iron horn, twisted antenna, and how it claws at itself in pain. One of its drops, the contrary scale, describes the two halves of its being as seemingly trying to devour each other. Is this literal or symbolic? Either way, it's a masterfully designed and evocative creature, but it also provides the first template for an elder variation that is not just a monster in a volatile or mature stage of life, but one that has, through environmental circumstance, gone awry. Much as Gore Magala served as a template for changes in how elders became conceptualized and framed in subsequent titles, discussed in my previous video, chaotic Gore Magala provides a foundation for the trajectory of elder variants. This is arguably even within its own title, as the rusted Kushala in that game potentially steps outside the normal life cycles of rusting and molting and seemingly becomes trapped in its oxidizing skin. What I can say for now, though, is that Chaotic Gore's variant as Aberration paradigm had a strong influence on the variants present in 5th gen. Ruin and Nergigante, Nawa the Allmother, Blackveil Vaal Hazak, Crimson Glow Valstrax, and Malzeno. Normal Malzeno, for reasons that should be evident. I'm mostly going to focus on the latter three, which are where the pattern asserts itself clearest, and in ways that I think have ramifications for the narrative and for the monster roster, but I want to address the first two quickly. Ruin and Nergigante and Nawa the Allmother straddle the transition between natural development, as seen in Rusted Kushala, and aberration, as seen in Chaotic Gore, but in fairly distinct ways. In this, they are perhaps analogous to that 4th gen Rusted Kushala. They are at once elders undergoing a life cycle change, but a change that perhaps carries an undercurrent of the aberrant. Ruiner, arguably at first, matches the standard pattern in Rusted Kushala Deora. It is a Nergigante that is older, although here it is specifically one hardened by countless battles. Its spikes have hardened, becoming more metallic. Yet there is also something off about Ruin and Nergigante, and specifically with the translucent spikes that are called its Diamond Thorns. Diamond Thorns are unique in that they do not regenerate. Rather, they grow on areas of its body that have suffered repeated physical trauma and result from a mutation, and they are grown whenever the Ruin and Nergigante senses danger. While these growths are powerful in combat, often causing lacerations and bleed, the Diamond Thorn here points us to a Nergigante that might actually be breaking down on a fundamental level. These thorns cannot regenerate, the Elder's signature quality, and are effectively grown as a stress response. Much like Kushala eventually dies as its organs are fully metallicized, I wonder if a Nergigante grown old enough might eventually lose its regeneration entirely and become a kind of diamond glass cannon running only on spiked cortisol. Ruina here might thus point us not only to a natural development of the Nergigante life cycle, but potentially also to the deleterious effects of old age, the gradual misfiring and breakdown of its bodily functions over time and repeated trauma. Nawa the Allmother is also an interesting case. Allmother is a gravid Nawa, but not strictly in a normal sense. Rather, it is a last-ditch effort at safeguarding the reproductive cycle through sexual cannibalism. By devouring its mated Ibushi, the Nawa is able to transform into this variant state. The term Allmother likely alludes to Odin, the Allfather, elevating her to a realm of the divine, a deity of war, death, poetry, and magic, fitting for the serpent. The Japanese name is also fairly illustrative here. She becomes Hyakuryo no Engen, origin of 100 dragons. This name alludes to the Japanese name of the rampage, the Night Parade of 100 Dragons, itself a reference to the yokai folktale of the Night Parade of 100 Demons. Translated more literally, therefore, we might say that she becomes Nawa, Mother of the Rampage. This is interesting because we learn over the course of Rise's story that the rampage is more specifically caused by Ibushi in its searching and clearing territory for its mate. Nawa the Allmother, inheriting Ibushi's wind powers, thus seems to transcend the normally sexually dimorphic morphology of its species, and becomes a potentially hermaphroditic existence, and is able to therefore embody the sole source of the rampage, a kind of draconic singularity. Like the diamond thorns that may slowly cover Nergigante, there is something aberrant here. Nawa exceeds the realms of the normal animality of her species and becomes something distinctly other. The next three variants, though, are the reason this video exists, because I find them fascinating both on an ecological and a lore level, and also on the level of pragmatic game design, and the way that these intersect. How their respective games frame these variant elders is important for understanding some of the core motivations behind developing and including variant elder dragons in general, because these variants all share a core theme that justifies the player's actions in always slaying them. They are not simply aberrant, but sick, and sick in a way that damages themselves and the surrounding ecosystem. These are monsters framed as in pain, infested, and breaking down. Killing them is specifically the kind of an action that an ecologically conscientious guild would do. While Malzeno is a monster that acts as the flagship of Sunbreak, and as the form initially encountered by the guild, it is itself a variant. Not in in-game classification, but in ecological actuality. Sunbreak's final title update added Primordial Malzeno to the game, the original untainted example of the species. Primordial means at core something original, basal, and fundamental. A thing as it has existed since the beginning of time itself. This is a relatively accurate translation of the Japanese title, which is Gensho Kuzamu, although this also carries a potentially subtle connotation that the English can't really include. Translation is like that after all. Gensho is quite simply an origin, source, or starting point, whereas the verb kizamu can mean a variety of things, including to engrave, chisel, etch in memory, to record as one might a passing moment. That is, Primordial Malzeno is a Malzeno who remembers its origin, marks it as one might engrave a memory upon a tree. But Kizamu in its more archaic forms can also mean to torment. Primordial Malzeno is a Malzeno that is tormented by its origin, by the majestic creature it once was and the struggle to maintain this majesty. It is beautifully tragic, and the name fits so well the dance of the fight as it attempts and fails to fight off the Curio. Yet if Primordial Malzeno is the monster fighting to retain its original identity, the Malzeno we often encounter is the far too common consequence of its failure. Malzeno is specifically diseased. it is infested with curio. And while it has formed a symbiosis with them, it is ultimately little more than a dragon hosting a swarm of rabid bats. This shifts with the not a variant. While you can slay Primordial Malzeno in subsequent quests, at least to my knowledge, and in situations where it proves unable to combat the curio it would be wise to, the initial canon encounter noticeably ends in a repel. Fiorane and the Fierce Flame of Kimura recognize that the Elder is not actually a threat, not if it can be safeguarded from parasite infestation. Now, it must be said that Malzeno does seem to be uniquely vulnerable to curio infestation, but that is another matter for the ecologists of the guild to debate. My point here is that, given what we are presented in-game, the only real reason to slay Malzeno is due to it being driven mad by an external biological force. This is not something innate or internal to the Malzeno itself. The same is true for the next two monsters in the category, Blackveil Vaal Hazak and Crimson Glow Valstrax. If Primordial Malzeno asks the question, why wouldn't I hunt this thing? These variants exist to answer the opposite. Why on earth would the guild hunt these things at all, generally speaking, rather than in specific circumstances? Vaal Hazak, the normal Vaal Hazak, is an effectively peaceable elder dragon whose existence isn't even confirmed when you are sent to investigate it. It is primarily a filter feeder who resides in the Rotten Vale, and has a set place within that ecosystem. It only really becomes a threat when its variant emerges, because this variant is migratory. It is no longer confined to the Vale, but rather brings the Vale with it in the form of mold spores and effluvium, infecting the surrounding environment, and thereby causes actual ecological disruption. The name Black Veil is intended to evoke the veils and cloaks of mourning and of death, and this is even more direct in its original Japanese title, Shiomato, literally wreathed in or wearing death. Unlike its basal species, Black Veil carries death, for itself in how it has gone blind, signifying its own woundedness, but also to the world around it. While I am a fairly prominent critic of how the Vaal Hazak mission plays out in base world, slaying a Black Veil in the Ancient Forest makes sense, because it is actually a threat to the Ancient Forest ecosystem, and, ideally, you want Vaal Hazak to stay peacefully in the Vale where they're at home. It's also, much like Malzeno, clearly not doing too hot. It's gone blind and is covered in mold. It is not a healthy animal. Valstrax actually has a similar issue to Vaal Hazak, although perhaps one that is less immediately obvious. Valstrax is almost exclusively airborne. It descends only really to hunt, as any other large avian predator might do. It only attacks the exposition in GU when they cross over into its habitat, into the sky, and this is an understandable thing for an animal whose territory has been trespassed on to do. It views the intrusion as either potential prey, potential predator, or competition. This is also what Legiana does in World, for example. Other than this, Valstrax nests atop the ruined pinnacle. Much like Vaal Hazak, Valstrax is an elder dragon that has, at worst, a neutral relationship to its environment. It is not really a calamity. It's just a large animal who gets in the guild's way because they broke into its front yard and it saw them as an intruder. Now, Crimson Glow Valstrax is different. Like Black Veil, Crimson Glow is an aberrant member of its species. In this case, it is one whose body has malfunctioned, causing it to become more aggressive and volatile. Its Japanese variant prefix, Kushiki-kakyo, signals its aberrant qualities. Kushiki means weird, strange, or mysterious, whereas kakyo is an archaic and poetic compound referring to a crimson or red light, hence Crimson Glow Valstrax. The name captures the variant's depiction in lore as an omen of destruction and despair, a strange red light, a portent of devastation. Here, the archaic quality of Kakuyo reinforces the sense of ancient prophecy and ominous sightings in the skies, one which reinforces Crimson Glow's representation as an ill-fated shooting star. Importantly, though, unlike standard Valstrax, who seems chiefly to patrol its territory around the vicinity of the ruined pinnacle, Crimson Glow will range much further and attack a wide variety of animals and people. Its dragon energy is overflowing and volatile, giving it its moniker, rendering it nearly perpetually berserk. But like Black Veil's blanket of death-bringing spores, Crimson Glow's berserk behavior means that it makes sense for a hunter to slay it, the same way you might have to kill a big cat that has crossed out of its ecological niche and into the territory of feeding on humans. A thing that, in nature, is almost always due to some injury or defect that prevents it hunting its normal prey. We see here in these three variants, dragons that have gone wrong and therefore need to be put down because their wrongness, their sense of going awry, itself becomes the danger. My point here ultimately is that these are in effect variants that exist chiefly to justify slaying these monsters with a valid ecological rationale that was either absent or very specific previously. Although it is not the only variant to replace its basal species in Master Rank, it is an easy thing to headcanon that this is actually why standard Vaal Hazak does not exist in Iceborne's quests. It is not necessarily that standard Vaal Hazak no longer exists within the Vaal, but rather that the guild has recognized in the 3 years since World that there is no real, justifiable reason to hunt them down, so it concentrates its attentions on the more threatening variant. If, as I have suggested, the guild might be partially responsible for Black Veil's emergence, this might also be seen as an attempt to put the genie back in the bottle. Regardless though, it can operate as a form of containment, culling the variants to reinforce the ecological behavior of the basal species. Critically, however, and this is less a lore angle and more a franchise sustainability one, Black Veil also permits Vaal Hazak to be carried forward into future titles, not set in or around the Rotten Vale or an equivalent ecosystem. It is nomadic and plague-bearing. If one was to take up residence in the Scarlet Forest, it would be a very genuine threat to its ecosystem, and one the guild would be well in their right to hunt down. This line of logic that gives space for monsters to return is also, bluntly, the key reason that Crimson Glow Valstrax exists, and why it was effectively the first variant to appear without a base species in the same game. Given Ryze's hunting ground spread and map diversity, it would not really make sense for a standard Valstrax to be there, not just far away from the ruined pinnacle, but not really encroaching on its natural territory of the cloudy skies. Should the creature even exist far from its primary habitat, it seems to chiefly hang around up there and descends mainly to eat. By crafting a variant that is more volatile and aggressive, the devs have here created a space for Valstrax to be able to naturally return in the franchise without having a ruined pinnacle or high-altitude air travel in every game. Amusingly, Ascendance, with its skybound Eyrie, is shaping up to be probably the first game since its debut in which encountering a non-Crimson Glow Valstrax would actually make sense. By crafting aberrant variants like Crimson Glow and Black Veil, the developers here free themselves from having to include specific types of biome in every game in order to facilitate their return, which is not a constraint you want in a franchise in which fan-favourite returning monsters are a big selling point, especially for G-Rank expansions. At the same time, these three variants, including Malzeno, serve an ecological and narrative function in a more direct fashion. Black Veil, Crimson Glow, and base Malzeno are deviations in their respective elders' life cycles. They are not simply aged individuals or ones on either the verge or the aftermath of natural metamorphosis, but rather animals whose development has gone awry. They are chaotic Gore, not rusted Kushala. Yet while chaotic Gore is merely an intensification of an already ecosystem-threatening elder, these variants also exist for a much more specific reason. Gore Magalas are always a threat to the local ecosystem, chaotic or no. A rusted Kushala, provided its molting is not being prevented by additional injury, can simply be repelled until it molts and wanders off. But the three variants discussed here have undergone changes that make animals that would otherwise be relatively simple to avoid or even coexist alongside, or at least as much as you can with any large monster, into diseased threats that need to be put down. If hunting Vaal Hazak in the Vale makes no ecological sense, Black Veil gives us that sense. If no self-respecting Valstrax would descend beneath the stratosphere save for the occasional meal, then Crimson Glow brings it crashing down to Earth. If primordial Malzeno can coexist in proximity to civilizations, as we are told it did with the Kingdom, then the infested Malzeno brings these only to ruin. This structure is not an accident, it is a pattern in Elder variant construction, one that advanced the template first established with chaotic Gore in ways that better integrate Elder ecology into the core gameplay experience of hunting, in a way that simultaneously reduces cognitive dissonance among the player and helps to reinforce the internal logics of the world. As I mentioned above, this style of aberration also applies, albeit less intensely, to monsters like Ruin and Nergigante and Nawa the Allmother, monsters that are in many ways simply undergoing natural processes like rusted Kushala, but which also carry a sense of not being quite right. They are not just old or just gravid. There is something amiss here. This wrongness, this going awry, has increasingly conditioned Elder variants in recent generations, and it's possible that this will be extended to Rust Kushala when and if it formally returns, drawing on its alleged For You depiction in which it is unable to properly shed its skin. For Ascendant specifically, I can even imagine a kind of transitionary framework in which a Kushala fought in the Downpour or the Frostwinds, for example, might undergo oxidization faster, adopting more rusted-style moves and mannerisms, with a more formal Rusted Kushala Deora variant being reserved for one that is unable to alleviate this state. Irrespective of whether anything is done with Kushala, however, in closing I did want to add that I find the broad trajectory of Elder variants, and the relative absence of subspecies, misclassified or otherwise, in recent titles interesting from both a lore and a franchise direction perspective. Elder Dragons exist in a liminal position with regards to the ecology of the Monster Hunter world, and variants fill interesting niches within that. They separate Elder Dragons from the more general process of speciation, and retains their singularity, their sense of otherness. If Elders fulfill their function as calamities and natural disasters, Elder variants are a good way of injecting novelty into this framing. We are all familiar with freak weather phenomenon, after all, perhaps even more so in the current age of climate upheaval, and Elder variants are able to capture some of the dimensions of this. Aberrant, unusually destructive natural phenomenon that are not a product of evolutionary time, but rather of the life cycles of individuals. I am curious what Ascendants, given Wilds' singular focus on anthropogenic weather and the ramifications of mortal meddling in the elements, might give us in this regards. I wanted to say thank you all for tuning in, if indeed you still are. If you enjoyed this video, please like and leave a comment, and if you want to hear more from me, consider subscribing. I upload long-form videos every Monday evening UK time, discussing Monster Hunter and other games from my perspective as a humanities and social sciences academic. Either way, I hope you have a good week. Love and solidarity to you all. This has been Lifecycle, signing off.
Did I go and burst the bubble? Promise more than I can give. I tried to touch its cosmic sheen, but today all I smell is chlorine. Yesterday I